computer. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, now, Paul, you can do whatever you want. And
Okay, you
now I'm
want me
going
to
to
record
share
it
the
on the,
screen. And
okay,
there.
I'm recording on the cloud.
Okay, good. And I gotta, yeah. Why am I on my last picture?
Okay, we've got 18 participants now.
Well, we we got 28. Here's my lecture going backwards. Okay, start. This is the 6th lecture, and I'm going to try to summarize conventional economics. This is also done in the first few chapters of our books, which are backwards, Energy and Wealth of Nations. And I get most of these ideas here from my colleague, Kent Flitgard, who's a real economist, or more precisely, an economic historian. And I do want to tell you one thing. When I was first working with him, he said, I don't know, something to me, and I said, this was after I'd known him for 6 months, and I said, well, Paul, as a Marxist economist, how can you say whatever it was that he said? And he said, well, I'm not sure I was ever a Marxist economist. I'm an economic historian. But he said, once you understand biophysical economics, you can be no other kind. And I thought that was a really good statement. But what we're going to try to do now is review the process of economic thought through time. Now, it's very important to understand that what we call economics today is only one of a variety of ways that people in the past and occasionally today think about economies or economics. And it's almost an accident that we think as we do. Let's see. And you got to also realize that economies exist, whether or not we study them as economists. And so here are 2 young ladies with coffee from the tropics, and presumably they're in some city in the United States with shopping bags and very elegant clothes and blue fingernails and whatever else, all provided by the economy. Now, there are any number of ways you might wish to study this process, but mostly today we study it only one way, and I'm going to try to show you how we got there. And the word economics essentially did not exist before around 1900. The economists that existed, or what we call economists today, usually call themselves moral philosophers. And that's quite curious that somebody so involved in the secular world would be a moral philosopher. And I don't know what the men of the cloth, the religious people of the time, thought about these secular folks talking about moral philosophy. Okay, the first recognizable, and this is a little bit arbitrary, was it really a school of economics? Anyway, the first in the Western world, now you got to realize, of course, economies have existed as long as humans have been exploiting and creating nature. The Kung that we talked about, trade. Somebody who got an antelope might be, they don't do it formally, they just share with their neighbors, but they share a leg of antelope with somebody who's gotten a lot of mongongo nuts that day or whatever. But the first Western formal school of economics is called mercantilism. These were people who thought about trade. And their idea was that trade, that it was very much tied up with nationalism, with the king, and the idea that a nation's wealth and power were best served by increasing exports and trade. And certainly the English, the Dutch, just about everybody was thinking about this. And was the view that the duty of the king was to protect production jobs and state revenue, and to have a positive balance of trade. I actually learned this in high school, to our great amusement, is that you had to export more than you import, which we thought in terms of food in the 11th grade. But anyway, you'd have a positive balance of trade to gain treasure. This is what they thought about the first people in the Western world that formally thought much about this. And so the idea was you'd have a mother country that would import raw materials at low prices and export finished products at high prices to the colonies. And here we have two colonies, both interacting with the mother country, and a restriction of trade between the colonies. And you have to realize that the colonies were often, what was called the colonies were often the outposts, the East India Company or whatever, of the mother countries in these situations. So this was a very convenient logic for the age of colonialism. And a lot of formal economic thought tends to be very self-serving, self meaning not necessarily those who are themselves, but the countries that were coming up with these economic thoughts. So obviously, based on the winds that we talked about, and hence having some energy basis, we have trade from Europe bringing manufactured goods down to West Indies and South America and so forth, Georgia, and or sometimes going to Africa, bringing manufactured goods to Africa, picking up slaves, taking them to the West Indies. I think Cuba had more slaves than the United States at one point. And then bringing the slaves into what's called here British North America, which was then had fur, fish, timber, tobacco, going back with the westerlies winds to Europe. So it was all a very convenient system based on the winds and based on this concept of mercantilism. And the idea was ultimately you had to get more money from the manufactured goods than you paid for the raw materials, including slaves, timber, fish, whatever, going the other way. And here is just an image of the British interacting with the people in Southeast Asia, who obviously had their own economic systems generating great wealth, not for a large proportion of the people, but for some people, that was an exchange with England. And of course, this resulted, all of these things resulted in some things that are very characteristic of England in the movies and the novels of England, including tea, which certainly doesn't grow in England, and sugar, and a great degradation of the English teeth with all the sugar that came from Barbados. Here's Barbados here, which was British, and under slavery generated the sugar that came back to Great Britain. The tea coming from way over here in India, and coffee, I don't know where it came from at that time. Coffee originated in more or less in Ethiopia, in Africa. Although, there's 20 species of coffee trees and we only utilize 2 of them. So there's wild coffee here that should provide us with some interesting experiences. Okay, and here is a sort of nice view of trade in a French seaport of the time. This doesn't show the slaves producing the products or the perhaps poorly paid work people in France generating all this wealth you see in the picture. I do think personally, I always have been fascinated by, since I was a kid growing up near Boston and we'd go and visit the Constitution in Boston Harbor, what a magnificent product is a sailing ship that can cross the oceans and so forth. And all the crafts persons that together are required to generate one of these ships, and let alone the buildings in the past. All of this was economic activity, and one has to be very impressed with what people can do, mostly with their hands and with native raw materials such as timber, and all those ropes that are made from the leaves of plants. Amazing. Okay, now the first or second, depending how you want to say it, school of economics was a little bit more formal school. Was called physiocrats. And their most important writer was Canet, this guy here. And also perhaps Jacques Turgot. And they were noted for a number of things, perhaps most important, that all wealth comes from the land. They thought of the production of wealth, and it's important to think about how this is different from what came later. They wanted to know where ultimately wealth came from, and they said it came from the land. And so it came from agriculture, forestry, mines, and so forth. And they very strongly did not believe in regulating trade. We'll get to there in a moment. And Canet was the physician for King Louis, whoever it was. And he, at that time, they began to understand the circulation of blood. And he thought about economics as the circulation of value, starting from the land here on the bottom and going in various directions up to artisans and proprietors. And so there was a flow of wealth, but the wealth always started with the land and with the people who worked the land. Well, that's the physiocrats. And one of them became very important in the finances of France. And King Louis XVI was in charge, and the finances of the French government were in total chaos because of the exorbitant expenditures of the royal house. So Turgot wrote that taxes, that there should be no more borrowing, no more taxation, which was ruining a lot of the landowners, and that the government should stop having all this spectacle and building Versailles and all of the stuff that was going on in France. And he told the king that the anger, he could expect anger from those who had become accustomed to financial favors, privileges, and the upper class from the government, if he did what he had to do, which was to stop spending and stop giving away so much money. And wars also were very expensive. And Turgot almost saved France from the corruption and financial chaos that led to the French Revolution. And so this becomes a recurring issue in governments. If you do not manage your government well, whatever that might mean, you risk being overthrown, and those days losing your head. So all of these wealthy people were living off of extracting a great deal of wealth from the land, from the workers, to pay for their lavish lifestyles and clothes and paintings and whatever else, trappings of their wealthy palaces. And well, Turgot was not successful, and we all know what happened for good and bad, the French Revolution. But he abolished all restrictions on free trade and gain, and said people should be free to do whatever they want economically throughout the kingdom. And he came up with the term laissez-faire, which we still wrestle with today. And not everybody agreed with him, certainly not the mercantilists. So one of the things we need to see is from the beginning, the different perspectives on economics, or what we now call economics, were often in opposition to each other. And so the mercantilists wanted the king to greatly restrict the terms of trade to favor their own merchants. And the physiocrats said, laissez-faire, let people do what they want. That'll be best. So right from the start, there's some interesting oppositions, as of course we still have. Now, the next school is when economics really developed, and it's called the classical economics. And we start with Malthus, who may or may not be a classical economist, but he's best known now. I think he was a reverend, and he seems like a very harsh guy when you read his stuff. But he was a realist, and he was interested in how, as we in biology know, that if you start with two of an organism of a species and Daphne in a water jar or something, and you provide them with enough resources, it'll go 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. It'll grow exponentially, more and more and more over time. But Malthus said, well, human population, because of the passion between the sexes, which he thought was unlikely to be reduced, that the humans would always outgrow their food supply and hence be poor and miserable. And so he wanted stern limits on reproduction, or, just let the lower class breed themselves into oblivion or whatever. And it's a really pretty harsh view of the situation, and it's commonly referred to as Malthusianism. And it is important to remember that Charles Darwin, when he came up with the concept of evolution by natural selection, got his most important idea, which I think is maybe certainly one of the most important ideas any human has ever had, when he was reading for pleasure in the evening Malthus. And he thought about this potential for exponential growth of organisms. But obviously, the world wasn't becoming more and more abundant, even with rabbits, year after year. And so this led to his idea that most reproduction actually did not live to reproduce. Most organisms produced did not live to reproduce, and hence the concept of natural selection. So these ideas certainly were cross-fertilized in various ways at that time. So here's simply exponential growth of a population and the linear growth, which Malthus said was agriculture. Now, the most important, probably the most important economist ever is Adam Smith. And he's got statues, and he's on the 20-pound note in England and so forth. And he wrote this book called The Wealth of Nations. And that's why we have our book called Energy and the Wealth of Nations, reflecting Adam Smith and his importance in economics. Now, Adam Smith is generally held up by economists today and in the recent past of a relatively conservative nature. And they quote this from The Wealth of Nations. It is in defense of free markets, or if you wish, laissez-faire. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address themselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. So Adam Smith had this really marvelous and powerful idea that individuals working for their own self-interest what benefited all of us through their generations of goods and services that the rest of us wanted. And it's a great idea. And it's certainly what most people think about when they think about Adam Smith. But Adam Smith was a far more complex and thoughtful person than this one sentence here, 2 sentences. And he said, for example, it's not very unreasonable that the rich should contribute to the public expense, not only in proportion to their revenue, but something more than in that proportion. I remember when I was a paper boy in the 1954, and I'm delivering the Boston Globe in Hingham, Massachusetts, my hometown. And, I'd read the newspaper sometimes in between houses. And I remember reading that in 1954, when Eisenhower was president, a Republican and all, I remember reading that the wealthy paid up to 90% of their income, at least above a certain level, to the government. And that regular folks would pay, I don't know what it was, 25 or 30%. And I remember as a kid with no political values, thinking, well, that only makes sense. They have more money. They should give a larger proportion to the general tax funds. Now, through all kinds of machinations, the rich tend to pay a smaller percentage than the middle class. I don't know exactly what it is. It's greatly discussed, but remember when Romney was running for president, that he was paying 18% tax rate, much wealthier person than me. He had been, or his father had been president of an automobile company, American Motors. And that while I was paying 30%. He also said virtue is more to be feared than vice because its excesses are not subject to the regulation of conscience. And he also wrote this book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And there's nothing in this book that is consistent with that statement about the butcher and the baker and the brewer. It's a very quote unquote liberal in today's use. Incidentally, I need to define the word liberal. I spend a lot of time. I was a Fulbright scholar in Argentina, a country that I really, really liked and have many friends in. And I found out that they would use the word liberal completely differently from how I use, or we use the word liberal in Ashland, Oregon, or whatever. That liberal meant to them free trade, laissez-faire, liberal economic, not constrained by government edict. And that's how liberal is still often used in Europe. And it has become transfixed in how we use the word here, meaning somebody of a somewhat lefty political persuasion in the United States. Okay. Smith did not particularly trust the businessmen. He thought their interests were different from the public. He even says it comes from an order of men, meaning businessmen, who have generally an interest to deceive and even oppress the public. So these are concepts that we will later attribute to Marx, but Adam Smith was thinking about these things too. Now, as an aside, Napoleon lost at Waterloo at this time. And it's very interesting. Napoleon made one terrible decision. He set up his headquarters on a hill at Waterloo and saved his best horsemen in reserve. And unbeknownst to him, on the hill down in front of him was a trench, a road that had eroded over centuries in the soft soil to make a 20-foot or whatever it was, 12 or 20-foot deep rut. And at the end of the day, when Napoleon thought he had an advantage and had his very finest horsemen in reserve, sent them down in 3 waves down the hill to attack the British. And the first line of horsemen fell into this big ditch. And the second line fell on top of them. And the third, a few of them got over them. And that's what defeated Napoleon. Plus, he had the trots that day and was often unavailable for command. But Napoleon had far more liberal economic ideas than the British who defeated him. And in liberal, in this sense, classist. Napoleon was more of a, we would call him a populist today. He wanted to distribute, and even populist has funny meanings today, but he wanted to distribute the wealth much more widely than the British who defeated him. So that's just an aside. Now, the second great classical economist was David Ricardo. And I like what he said a lot in many respects. I mean, he looks like a nice guy. I don't know what he was like, but he was quite popular. He was a Spanish Jew who did very well in the British Parliament, and was clearly a very, very clever guy. I wish he'd been a little less political and had stuck to writing economic treatises, which were very interesting to me. And he wrote this theory of political economy, or the principle of political economy and taxation, 1817. And his main contributions were these words: principle of comparative advantage. I better explain that. He said, simplistically, I'm doing it now. If in Portugal you can grow wool, you can grow wine, you can grow grapes better than you can in England. And in England, you can grow wool better than you can in Portugal. Then in Portugal, you should focus on growing wine. And in England, you should grow wool, and you should then trade woolen from England to wine from Portugal. So because each country had comparative advantage, which is a kind of ecological concept, that there are conditions in the environment that favor this or that in different parts of the world. So you hear of people using comparative advantage today. He had the principle of diminishing marginal utility. I hope I remember that when we talk about neoclassical models. But anyway, diminishing marginal utility. He thought principally in terms of land. And he said, think of a new area that's being colonized or developed, whatever word we might want to say. And it might be a river valley. And initially, people will put their agriculture, and boy, did I see this in Latin America when I was working down there. They would put their agriculture in the very flattest, best, usually bottomland of an area, and then have their fields outside. And then as the populations grew, the fields were increasingly pushed up the slopes and up the river valleys into increasingly poor land. And this this Ricardo understood and wrote about very well. And he said the price will be set by the last farmer, the price for example, corn he would use, meaning grain, it would be set by the last farmer on the poorest land, and all of the farmers on the better land would make a higher profit. He was very pro-free trade. Britain had at that time corn laws, so-called corn laws, corn again meaning barley mostly, that protected the profits of the wealthy elite who owned the large landholdings. And he also, he and Smith came up with a labor theory of value. The value came from the work of the laborers. And that's very important for classical economists. Okay, next is John Stuart Mill. My friend Kent likes this guy a lot. And he was liberal in the modern sense, and he was an exponent of utilitarianism, that if it works, do it. And the quote on the bottom, most widely read liberal argument in support of the value of liberty. Liberty comes up again and again mixed in with economics, and like Thomas Jefferson's concepts of liberty, it's used by often opposing political groups. His words will be used by people with very different meanings of them. And anyway, he liked spontaneity, individuality, and diversity, and had contempt for compulsive uniformity and the despotism of popular opinion. There you have it. I know less about him. Meanwhile, of course, many people in England were horribly poor from the economic processes that were going. But these people were at this point pretty much neglected by economists. I talked a little bit earlier about women who'd work in mills in very dangerous conditions and so forth, and everything was pressed for the economic advantage of those in charge. But Charles Dickens and others had a much larger impact of bettering the lives of these folks than any economist did. Now we come to the next great economist, who's Karl Marx. And Marx is widely misunderstood and maligned. He wasn't what most people thought he perceives him to be now. It's quite curious. He was a German Jew who lived in London, poor but financially backed by Friedrich Engels, who was the son of an industrialist. He is a much better source for understanding capitalism than of communism. He wrote a great deal more about capitalism, often with great insight, and very little about communism, within which he had very poor insight. He perhaps simplistically thought, but most of what was going on was the conflict between the bourgeoisie, the owners of property, and the proletarians, the workers. And well, that still exists for sure. Now, Marx had a theory of history. It was quite curious. People thought this was scientific. He just came up with it. He had 6 stages: primitive communism, hunter-gatherers, etc., slave society, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and finally global stateless communism. Well, maybe the first four have often happened. And the rest is depends. Now, I found this quote: Marx's writing should not be taken to mean that everything that has ever happened is a matter of class struggle. It means rather that class struggle is most fundamental to human history. There are others, some who argue that this is a recent phenomena, that we used to live in more egalitarian societies of hunter-gatherers and early agriculturalists. It's all I can say, it's been a big mix. Marx thought his ideas were most appropriate for England and Germany, for the industrialized states. He would have been very surprised to find that, in fact, they were taken up by, backwards, that's from an Englishman's view, Russia and China. He thought that once the sixth stage of global capitalism, global communism was reached, that the state would wither away, but he did not say how. And in fact, the opposite tended to happen, that communism was used by strong despots to consolidate their power, Lenin and especially Stalin and so forth. Mao Zedong, maybe communism in China today, whatever. So that, because there was a big possible movement towards communism until most people understood that communism tended to give dictators too much power. Now, that's not part of communism. It's just that certain people use whatever tools they can to subjugate or lead, or whatever you want to say, the people that are below them. But anyway, that has tended to give communism a very bad name in the United States and elsewhere. These thinkers, from Smith to Marx, generally are called classical economists today. One thing that unifies all of them is the belief in the labor theory of value, that economic value comes from the activity of laborers. This is to be contrasted with the physiocrat view, that it comes from the land, or the mercantilist view, that it comes from trade. And most, and certainly Ricardo, understood the importance of land and resources. And Marx and Engels probably understood energy. In their letters, you can find some pretty insightful views on energy, but they didn't put it into their major writings. But Marx, in a certain sense, understood the modern dilemma. And here's a good quote from him: in modern agriculture, as in modern industry, the mobility of labor is purchased at the cost of laying waste and debilitating labor power itself. Moreover, all progress in capitalist agriculture is a progress in the art, not only of robbing the worker, but of robbing the soil. These people were not fools. In fact, these were very smart people. Now, the critiques of Marx are numerous. And often they would say that Marxism, well, the biggest one was a lack of incentive, that Marxism summarized perhaps as that all should contribute according to their abilities and take according to their needs. doesn't give productive people incentives for the hard work that they do in their high production that they do. And these relative conservatives, Milton Friedman and especially Friedrich Hayek and others, say that Marxism tramples on individual rights and so forth. Well, in the interest of class views and so forth. Well, Marx probably didn't say these things. I mean, a lot of people attributed to Marx things that he didn't particularly believe himself, or that we don't know, or maybe I'm ignorant of is a better way of saying it. But so anyway, Marxism has pretty much disappeared from in the West from the political view. Now, at this time, classical economics as an intellectual entity ran into a big problem. And because of this problem, many people said it had failed, which is they couldn't solve the water versus diamonds paradox. And this was originally raised by Adam Smith. Nothing is more useful than water, but it will purchase scarce anything. A scarce anything can be had in exchange for it. A diamond, on the contrary, has scarce any value in use, but a very great quantity of other goods may frequently be had in exchange for it. And this is sort of opposite a utilitarian perspective of Mill, that how can something that's so useless, I don't think they used industrial diamonds too much back then, be so expensive? And 3 people at one time came up with a resolution to this problem. And this is, that B should be an N. Neoclassical economics. This was the origin of neoclassical economics, the kind of economics that dominates now. And it came out because these 3 people solved the diamonds versus water paradox. And they were William Stanley Jevons. Remember him from the coal question? I mean, he was my hero there, and my bad guy for what he did here, since I'm not a fan of neoclassical economics. Paul Mengers and Leon Varas, not Walrus, but Varas or something like that. All at about the same time came up with a resolution in what they called, and they were using the word economics here, perhaps for the first time. And the diamond versus paradox was solved by what they call marginal value or marginal utility. Now, think of it yourself. The first liter of water you might have is worth everything else you have. The first liter of water a day, because you need it to survive, and you trade everything you owned, your home and whatever, for that liter of water, if no other liters of water were available. And the second one is not as valuable, but very valuable. And then the 10th liter, less valuable, but still very valuable. You can cook with it and wash with it and so forth. And the 100th liter, you can water your plants, and it becomes less and less valuable. So it's called marginal utility. The margin means more or less where you are at the moment. So you might get 8,000 liters of water a day. I mean, I don't know if that's what this 8,000 means, but let's say you get 8,000 liters of water a day. And you only have to pay the rate of the 8,000th liter. You don't have to pay $1,000 for that first liter because you're supplied with 8,000 liters. And so this area in here is called the consumer surplus. And economists love it and view economic. Well, from this point, one of the things that this allowed economists to do was to quantify and mathematize economics. And they came up with, I'm not going to explain all this stuff, but they came up with all kinds of supply and demand equations. I asked a friend of mine who majored in economics at my alma mater at Colgate, and I said, "Would you learn in economics?" And he went like that. And so this is more or less how economics works: is if the quantity available increases, how will the price respond, and so forth. And it allows you to mathematize economics, including when you shouldn't. And so once this was resolved, neoclassical economics came into being. And these things happened simultaneously. The concept of consumer sovereignty, meaning you can go to the market and buy what you want if you got enough money, was conflated with individual freedom. So, I mean, Ronald Reagan was very successful at taking people's perception of religious and personal freedom and so forth and conflating that with free markets and completely changing the American political landscape. And this mathematization and so forth, and the concept that a free market was supposed to bring the maximum benefit to consumers via something called Pareto optimality. Economists love this, and it's, well, we may get to some of the issues with it. And other things, that you might make a cheap, for example, leather in a tannery on a river, and the people downstream have to deal with all of the tannery waste that kills the fish of the fishermen and the pleasure of bathing for many people. Well, the economists couldn't incorporate this well. The neoclassical economists, this didn't incorporate very well into their mathematical assessments of the economy. So they call them externalities. And they say, well, we'll go let somebody else resolve that. It's not our business. And of course, it's changing a bit on that front now. And something very few people know about was the Mount Parallel Society. I had a student do his PhD dissertation on this, and I learned an awful lot about this. This is how a relatively small amount of money, let's say $1 million, was used to support a bunch of thinkers, including Frederick Hayek, in this Mount Parallel Society that was extremely influential in packaging these conservative neoclassical market-oriented laissez-faire, no government control, no there. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So this was and I'm not saying conservatives are the only ones to do this. people of various political persuasions would use these economic ideas to support whatever perspective they liked, whether or not they were consistent with the original ideas of the economists who came up with them. The labor theory of value was highly criticized, and the Austrian school liked the subjective theory of value, that nothing is more important than consumer sovereignty in the marketplace, et cetera, et cetera. Now, economics at this time became formalized. We had a definition, the study of the allocation of scarce resources amongst alternate users. Now, you got to understand that resources here means money in your wallet, essentially, not resources like we might think of water or soil or whatever, good soil or whatever. Anyway, economics became a real discipline, and they came up with this model of how economics works, which is in the first chapter of essentially every economics textbook. And we have two components of an economy: households and firms. And firms make goods and services and sell them to households, and households provide land, labor, and capital to firms, and the money goes around the other way, and it's a perpetual motion machine. And this is the basis of neoclassical economics as it's taught in practice today. Obviously, next week we'll have something to say about that. Alfred Marshall was very important in the development of neoclassical economics, and he came up with all kinds of terms: price elasticity, consumer surplus, and so forth, and greatly increased our ability to do manipulations within economics. And he was very influenced also by Darwin's idea about biological evolution, and he thought that firms evolved. Now, then along came somebody really important, Keynes. A big problem with economics, with economies, and economics, that economics could not explain the violent cycling of boom and bust periods. That the process of production had become so efficient that firms could produce far more goods than could be sold. And they'd pile up in warehouses, and depressions, then workers, there's no need for them, so they'd be put out of work and so forth. And these booms and busts were very characteristic of the capitalist system in the 1800s. It caused a great deal of pain, and economists had no idea how to deal with them, or even how to think about them. Here's going back, this is the growth rate of the economy, which you see often grows up to 15% a year. This is the US. This is from 1950 to almost 2020. But periodically it has these busts. It's extremely cyclical. And I couldn't find a good data set, but found this sort of cartoon of it. It was well understood and did occur strongly back in 1800s. So this boom and bust was a big problem. So along came John Maynard Keynes, and wrote this very important book, and he was a very, very smart guy. Keynesian economics, a macroeconomic, macro meaning, yeah, thinking about the economy as a whole, theory of total spending in the economy and its effects on output, employment, and inflation. And he came up with this idea: increase government spending in times of economic contraction and decrease government spending in times of economic expansion. In other words, use the government spending to take out the cycles. And you had tools fiscal, which are taxation and spending, and monetary. And people argue about those today all the time. And by golly, it looked like it worked. So sometime around here, 2/3 of the way through this graph, this is the US, and I made this graph for other reasons. The violent oscillations seem to be decreasing. And many people, no, not many people, some people, me, said, well, this is what Keynesian economics has done. And during the whole time I was growing up, we were told that each generation could expect to be richer than their generation before, that depressions wouldn't come along. My parents were totally scarred by the Depression. And let me tell you, my wife complains the fact that I can't throw away anything. That goes back, my sister said, well, that comes from our parents. They were terrified of another depression, but I never had one. We had rather a pretty good one in the 1970s, but we'll talk about that later. Now, neoclassical economics is dominant today. Most economic investment decisions are made using discounted cash flow with the objective of maximizing profit. I just mentioned, for make sure you understand, that discount means that $1 today is worth more than $1 in a year or 10 years or whatever. And that when you're doing investment decisions, you correct for the value of money over time, which is somewhere between 5 and 10% a year, usually. So you discount future gains. It also means you discount the environment if you happen to sneak the environment into your equations. And so now, almost all basic economic ideas that are just set in stone today, you can look at very, very differently. They're not necessarily true. There's a certain logic to discounting the future. You'd want $1 today more than $1 in a year. For one thing, you might die in that year. But most people have a negative discount rate. Why? Because they have children. And children means you're going to spend future money that you've committed yourself to their future, usually. And you wouldn't have children if you really believed in a discount rate. And most people care a lot about the future. But that's not considered in economic calculations. Most arguments that remain today is to what degree we should be a Keynesian. And this is true despite some clear problems. And I have listed them here: unequal distribution, failure of Phillips curve, secular stagnation, inflation, externalities, all of which have a biophysical basis, which we're going to talk about next time. I'll just show these slides quickly and finish. This is the income earned by the top 1% in the US. So it's the system of neoclassical economics helps enhance the difference between the rich and the poor. So the top 1% in wealth earn more than the bottom 50% and increasingly so. The Phillips curve was beloved by economists, and the unemployment rate was thought to be inverse to inflation. So when we had great inflation in the 1970s, the economists said to, I think it was Jimmy Carter at the time, that, oh, well, what you got to do is increase unemployment. It's all kinds of people were deliberately thrown out of work, and that's happening to a smaller degree now, in order to increase inflation. Well, this is what the inflation, what the Phillips curve is from 61 to 69. But look what happened subsequently. It went, it both increased. So we'll talk about that next time. Secular stagnation, the growth rate of the U.S. economy and of the world economy, you know, OECD, which means Europe and Japan and U.S. basically, Australia, has been decreasing. Well, secular stagnation. We're not growing as much. Debt, of course, has increased enormously. There was a failure to resolve Solo's residual. I'm going to talk about that next time. These are, meanwhile, the neoclassical economics has nothing to say about what might be the most important issues that have been thought about by economists in the past. Population growth, depletion, climate change, environmental destruction. Neoclassical economics essentially has nothing to say about those unless they enter the market, because it lets the market decide. So here's the human population growth. Most intense hurricanes apparently is increasing. Why has neoclassical economics failed to do this? Well, it has to do with the intellectual isolation of economics, and especially its ignorance of and ignoring of the most basic laws of physics, and I might add ecology. Hardly anyone mentions the main driver, industrialization. That's a BASF plant in Germany. All petrochemicals being moved into whatever else. Some 40 years ago, in the journal Science, Nobel Prize winner in economics, Vasily Leontief, surveyed the then present state of economic models and economics in general, and said they were unable to advance in any perceptible way a systematic understanding of the operation of a real economic system. Instead, they were based on sets of more or less plausible but entirely arbitrary assumptions, leading to precisely stated but irrelevant theoretical conclusions. This is a Nobel Prize winner in economics saying this about economics. And I can find lots of other quotes of that nature. And that leads us to, he extolled other investigators in demography, sociopolitical science, ecology, biology, health sciences, and engineering to help remove economics from the splendid isolation in which it is found. Okay, so where are we now? This is my last slide. We're stuck in a hodgepodge of these economic concepts accentuated by political oddities and enthusiasms. President Biden is essentially a neo-Keynesian with his rebuilding America infrastructure approaches. It works, but it has something to do with inflation too. The Federal Reserve is attempting to tamp down some of the resultant inflation. we are left with a legacy of Reagan-Bush past tax cuts, especially for the rich. It was supposed to trickle down, but it didn't, quite the opposite. So I leave you with this quote from Keynes. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economists. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. And here we are. Okay, 5-minute break, but I'll stay here. I'm on a roll here, so I'll just hang. I'll take any, let's see, I gotta get out of my screen sharing, which I don't know how to do. New share. Okay, pause, stop share. And okay, here we are.
You could,
And anybody who wants to take a break, but boy, Ann, are you gonna ask me a question?
I'm just going to make a comment. Seeing as how I spent most of my career in reproductive health and birth control, that was a concept that did not exist. The choice of being able to limit population growth. So, every time you think about Malthus and, some of those concepts, passions of people and so forth, there didn't seem to be a solution to that. But we
Well, we
have,
have it.
now we have them, and some people don't want us to have them. And I don't know, I wonder if they have a species perspective. Because that is certainly the consequence. The economy wants there to be consumers, but they have to be consumers that have means. Otherwise, all this production has no place to go. And then we end up with, I don't know, what are those non-fungible tokens? It's not even a real thing, and people pay money for them.
Oh, Bitcoins?
No,
Bit-
it's like I don't know, some like a piece of art that you don't actually have, but you have the rights to or something. And anybody know anything about non-fungible tokens? It's like a weird thing. Anyway, well, I'm outside my what do you call it? Intellectual understanding of that, but there's just strange things
Comfort zone.
people are spending money on that you don't understand why they have any value to them.
Yeah,
Anyway,
and every now
Well,
and
I
then,
go to a mall and I can't find anything I'd like to buy.
I know.
And I wonder what the hell are all these people doing in malls?
You don't see them with shopping bags. I think they're exercising indoors.
Oh, that makes sense, I guess. I don't know.
I
I
think
mean,
take my grandson there to run around so that I can keep pace with him without him running into a car.
well, sometimes my students would ask what I do for the environment, and I have to say that I've certainly lived a reasonably comfortable middle-class life, and I've professionally been on an airplane all over the world. But I say, well, the only thing that I've done of any particular importance is I didn't breed. And when I die, it'll stop. But on the other hand, I do, to the annoyance of my wife, I try not to spend any money. Because every time you spend $1, you're using about 5 megajoules, about maybe a third of a cup of coffee of oil's worth of energy. We'll talk about that more next time. So
are we
yeah.
moving, Charlie, to some kind of more rational economics? I mean, what you've
No,
described
no,
is completely
absolutely not.
irrational.
No.
Once we left behind the moral philosophers, it seems to have gone completely haywire.
Well, there's only one choice left now, which is political, is whether you believe in a bit more of a Keynesian, and one might add humanistic or something approach, and then you usually vote Democrats, or you believe that debt and too much government power is the problem, and then you tend to vote for Republicans, and that's about what we have. And every politician, to my knowledge, just about every politician runs on more. That you grow the economy more, and that solves all problems, and that's what we're going to do. And there are some quasi-political movements, the Zero Growth Society and the Negative Growth Society, and in Europe, the Green parties sometimes advocate such a position. But when I think of a good or service, I look at something in a store window, and I don't think about how much it costs. I think about how much oil was used to make it and how much environmental destruction was occasioned. It's not the usual way we're toilet trained to think of the economy, but it's how I think about it.
I like your last slide about what classical economics has ignored. You can see, I guess, back in the 16, 17, 1800s, we didn't have these constraints, so people weren't thinking about them because of the size of our population and consumption relative to what the earth could support. And now we're reaching those limits, and we're finding that we can no longer ignore these things.
Right, and they're just not part of how we make economic decisions, and economics is how we make decisions.
Mhm. Yeah,
Basically,
the idea that we have to
cost
continually
benefit analysis.
consume to support the economy doesn't necessarily seem to be the solution anymore.
Have
You
have
bet.
you, have you looked at the donut theory of economics?
Yes,
It takes into account some of the um, concerns about the environment and social equity, things like that. I just started reading it, and I think I bought the book, but I can't find it in my.
Kate something worth.
Yeah, uh-huh.
Yeah, I haven't read it except a little bit. And I think I'm not especially enthusiastic, because it's, to a certain extent, she wants everything recycled. And that's the basic principle of thermodynamics. You can't. I mean, energy has to be a throughput. And even copper or something like that, as you recycle it, each time you recycle it, I mean, at the very best, you can get 70 or 80% of your copper back. And you think about all of the copper that's in all the electronics that goes into dumps, and they have people in Asia stripping the wires out of old computers to get the copper. But you're still losing a certain percentage, and then we don't do that in this country, so they load all the old computers and stuff into junk bins in containers and send them over, using oil, of course, to Asia, where people will do that kind of stuff for pennies per hour. And I don't understand. Rayworth, I think her name is Kate Rayworth, and I think we can go in that direction, but whether we can do what she wants is pretty hard for me to imagine it working. there's a place in Germany or Netherlands or somewhere called Kahlenberg, in which they have a whole industrial plant, and this comes closest to what she talks about, where the waste product of one industry becomes the input to the next.
Mm.
And but it's been around for a long time, and we don't have other Kallenbergs that I am aware of. So, you can make it work, but by using how much energy I ask and how much input of other stuff that comes from somewhere else, maybe China, who knows?
Well, the other thing you talked about was the movement of things from one market to another, and the energy involved in that, and those the shipping or however you get it from one place to the other. One of the books I read called Salt talks about how salt was mined in India, and they actually did not allow the people in India to use the salt that was produced. They had to buy it back from the UK, the Brits,
Yeah.
and that was the basis for the Indian throw of Britain as their colonizer.
They even, I understand, in Madras, where there were competitors with Manchester for generating cloth, the British actually cut off the fingers.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. So you have the goods right there to do it. You have the workers there to do it, and they can't, politically are not permitted. So
I don't know. It's just, the thing is, whatever whatever economic theory or concept or system that you have, people seem to abuse it for their own use, and we don't, this is also not particularly, it was originally by moral philosophers, but it is not the concern of economists to think about this very, very deeply. They power until Marx, and Marx thought about it a great deal, but he thought about it not in terms of kings and subjects, but bourgeois and proletariat. Paul has a book. Oh, it looks like Herman Daly.
Yeah, I'm just saying I don't know if his approach you would consider compatible.
Oh, I'm a great fan of Herman. I knew him well, and I just wrote a review of him for Bioscience, which I guess I'm going to send to everybody.
Okay.
It's pretty short, and I think it summarizes a lot. And Herman influenced my thinking a great deal over time. I'd love to see some more faces here and get some questions from people that we don't hear from so much. It's your class too. Anybody want to turn on their camera, please do. And if you don't want to, you don't have to. That's not required. Maybe they've gone. I don't know. So
But
come on, let's get a few more questions. Hello, Anthony.
well, I mean, I would guess one reason that Herman was as active as he was because economics really didn't work.
Oh, he really understood economics, and he says it's a house of cards.
Yeah.
And he would help to form ecological economics, but late in his life, I talked to him about that, and he was pretty unhappy with ecological economics, as was I. I thought that that was going to focus more on the problems, but it basically turned into a means of putting a dollar value on nature and then turning the same old neoclassical crank. That's to me very disappointing.
You know, one of the things you said was, or one of the tenets, I guess, is that work, you know, and people won't work if they're not paid. And I just think I'm looking at a lot of people here who are busy volunteers, and they're working. I am working as a volunteer. I would think there's an inherent value in work, meaningful work, and that people will work for no pay if they have their basic needs met. As those of us who are lucky enough to have pensions and Social Security are at that phase of life where we don't necessarily need to work for money, but we do value the opportunity to work.
Well,
I see some volunteers here. And you know,
I spent my life teaching mostly in New York, a highly industrialized state. And I love my teaching, and I love being a professor. And I said I'd even do my PhD, even if I do that project, even if I didn't get a PhD from it. I liked it so much. And so I've been really lucky. But you know, you read Studs Terkel, who I think is a really insightful guy. He's sort of a modern day Mencken. And he said most people don't like their jobs very much. Yeah, and the people who are able to retire in Ashland, most of us seem to have had a pretty comfortable, have enjoyed our work, but I'm not sure that that's true for people that are in agriculture or the production line or whatever. So I don't know. But you know, in neoclassical economics, you're valued as a worker according to what your salary is. And you're supposed to get paid in proportion to your value. So some CEO, just reading about the CEOs of Disney making $40 million a year, while in firing 5,000 people because he can't afford to pay for them. I mean, what the hell's going on? So I don't know,
Where does
but
the stockholder fit in?
Oh, Craig is saying he's having problems with the Zoom setup. Craig, let's see if I can do anything. I can ask you to unmute you. I can ask to start video. I can ask you, which is apparently not the problem.
There I
Oh,
am.
here's Craig. Hi, Craig.
Hi. What I'm saying is that if you look at the list of people in your class, most of them are not visible. And I think there may be something in the way you set up your Zoom that makes people automatically either visible or not visible. Because in other classes, it automatically I automatically become visible in my little square.
Well, I'll try to look into that, Craig. And I wonder if you can help me on this issue. Not now, but sometime. We'll try to do something about it. And I believe that there are some people who prefer going to the website and watching the class at their leisure. I don't know how many. And to tell you the truth, I'm hoping to take these lectures, which I think they're pretty good, and packaging them. And we're starting out with all the junior colleges in Maryland, maybe. that this would be made available to people who want to get a more general introduction to economics than what you get from your economics course, which basically this. Oh, Greg, have you got a question about the content?
Not at the moment. It's very interesting.
What did you do? What did everybody do with their life? I understand there's two oil people in this class. Somebody told me.
Not in this class. I'm within Ollie. I think
Oh, okay.
they probably might not have known that you would be touching on this area, so I'm sure they would be interested in the content, especially the last one. And I know that we have people who have taught on economics within Ollie. So
Well, I mean, should I give this class again? We're going to take a survey. Ted thinks so anyway. So, but I would ask each of you to get at least one or two people to interested. Talk to your friends a little bit. Would you do that so we can discuss this? You know anybody who you think would like to take this class? And how can we get these 8 lectures? Why aren't they shown to every freshman at Southern Oregon University?
well, we could
Yeah,
talk
it's
about
certainly
that.
a good
What'd
basis
you say, Ann?
for a life of study.
I said we
Yeah,
can
I
talk
mean,
about that.
physics is, excuse me, yeah, go ahead.
I'm just saying that I'm doing some intergenerational Ollie SOU connections, and so we can talk about that offside.
Great. I mean, why is physics taught here? Economics is taught here. Ecology is taught there. And yet I hope I've shown you that they're just all interrelated. They're all interconnected. Who's teaching that way? Does Ollie have anybody who has a synthetic view? I don't think so. And not only Ollie, every place I ever taught, and that includes, Ivy League and big state universities and all this kind of stuff. It's just all chopped up into pieces.
It might be a function of the PhD narrowing of people's knowledge and specialization.
My PhD went like this because I had a very special advisor, Howard Odom, in it. Paul, I think your education also at Louisiana State had some very, very great thinkers. Herman Daly taught at LSU, and my good friend John Day. So I think you were exposed to a very broad perspective, even though you specialized.
Well, I never successfully specialized.
Well, Charles, I have a friend who was a retired economic professor at SOU. I'd be willing to share some of your material with him if there's something succinct that he could look at besides each individual lesson.
Well, I've got what I have on the website that you have access to,
In the
but
Dropbox.
I'd be happy to meet with him or whatever, Ray.
Okay.
Whatever I think this information, I think every young person should be, especially, next lecture, should have access to this information. And I'm actually working with a philosopher, a guy who's a philosopher who wrote me, if you can believe it, because he was obsessed with Paul. He was obsessed with maximum power because he was a great scholar of Nietzsche, who has this will to power, which he thought was related to Odom's maximum power. And we've even written a paper that's in review right now on that issue. But he's the one who wants to get his undergraduates at the University of Maryland system to have access to these. And what we're trying to do is, personally, I'm a very happy, optimistic person. That's just my nature. And a lot of young people now seem to be quite distressed. Too much climate change thrown at them and some other things. And of course, my own perspective isn't going to help on that too much. But where I'm trying to work with this guy, Tim, to figure out we're trying to write a new philosophy for the age of science or something like that. And we're trying to come up with an optimistic conclusion. So that might be good for people to think about that, help us a little.
I don't think we
How do
can really predict the impact of artificial intelligence. I mean, if they analyze some of our so-called theories and practices, they may just decide we don't deserve to exist. I mean, maybe there are maybe the synthesis that you're talking about could be better done by artificial intelligence than by humans with our overlaying self-interest.
Ooh. I'm very leery of artificial intelligence because, I've been a computer programmer for much of my life. And I know it, well, at least my approach to computing was to have computers do what I wanted it to do. But that's something I do not have expertise on. And so,
Well, I don't-
okay. I hope I have given you today a pretty good introduction to the idea that economies exist. How we study them has changed over time. We are at a particular point in time where there's a particular perspective called neoclassical economics, which evolved from the resolution of the diamonds versus water paradox that is dominant today, that has been permuted by people with particular, often political perspectives into that which is taught today, which, as I will show you next time, is very inconsistent with what we know for sure, such as humans can know anything for sure, about the natural sciences and how we want to come up with something different, and it's possible to do so. So that's where we are now. And I will see you next week at the same address. And thankfully, everything worked today. And I'm open to an email at any time.
Thank you, Charlie.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Goodbye,
Thanks a lot,
everybody.
Charlie.
Thank you. See you next week.
Bye-bye.
I'm going to stop the recording.
Yeah, I'm doing that too, but it's not stopping.
Okay. Well,